So thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy. Again, thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here today. And it's going to be a talk which will mix a bit of philosophy and a bit of evolutionary biology and a bit of psychology, right? Today I'm going to talk about a growing literature within, let's say, philosophy and biology about the evolution of morality. And particularly I will focus on that book here, Richard Joyce, because that's one of the best books on the topic within philosophy. But what I will have to say will also bear on many of these books, including Mark Hauser's recent Moral Minds. Many of these books make the two following claims. The first one, as you might have guessed, is that morality evolved. The second one is that the evolution of morality has significant philosophical consequences, significant philosophical implications. And let me try to start with, to try to explain what these philosophical implications might well be, right? To see what these implications might well be, it's useful to start with two different beliefs. The belief in witch, or in witches, in the 17th century, people used to believe in witches, and our scientific beliefs nowadays. All right? So let's start with the belief in witches. Let's suppose that we have to explain why, in the 17th century, people used to believe in witches, right? To do so, what would we do? Well, we would refer to various historical contingencies, right? Historical events. We can also refer to the social function of this belief in the 17th century societies. That's something we could do. We could also say, well, you know, humans have a tendency to explain events or things by means of supernatural entities. We could do that too. But what we would not do, is to assume that there is a fact that witches are a fact. We would not explain people's belief in witches by saying, look, they were witches back then. And the fact that they were witches back then explains why people believed in witches, right? That's something we would not do. By contrast, think about our scientific beliefs. Think about our belief in evolution, right? How would you explain the fact that most people here, or I guess I should say everybody here, or most reasonable people, or almost every reasonable people, believe in evolution? Well, something you might want to say is, well, they believe in evolution because there is evidence for evolution, right? But of course, you could not have evidence for evolution if evolution was not a fact, right? So when you want to explain scientific beliefs, such as the belief in evolution, you do refer to the fact of evolution, right? So contrast the two beliefs. When you want to explain the belief in witches, you do not refer to the fact that they were witches, right? When you want to explain the belief in evolution, you have to refer to something about the world. Evolution was a fact, right? Okay, the contrast now should be clear. The question I'm interested in is, are our moral beliefs, or ethical beliefs, are they more like our belief in witches, or more like our belief of scientific beliefs? When you want to explain why people believe the moral things they believe, right? Torturing puppies for the sake of it is wrong, right? We all agree with that. It's not nice to torture puppies, right? When people believe that, do they believe that because there are moral facts, just like in the case of scientific beliefs, there are facts about moral things, and it does explain why people have their moral beliefs? Or is it more like the belief in witches, right? So that's the question. Are moral beliefs more like belief in witches? There are no moral facts, or are moral beliefs more like scientific beliefs? To explain why people have their moral beliefs, you need to refer to moral facts. Right? That's a question, that's a well-known question within philosophy. And many philosophers have said that evolution shows, the fact that morality evolved shows that our moral beliefs are just like our belief in witches. You don't need to assume that there are moral facts to explain why people believe what they believe in the moral domain. All right? And here is the argument that some philosophers have developed, including Richard Joyce and Michael Ruse. So they argue the following, that the argument of capacity to make moral judgments evolved, right? So morality evolved. The best explanation for its evolution is that it has been selected for, and then X in, you plug in your favorite theory of evolution, promoting social cooperation, for example. This explanation does not suppose that there are moral facts that make these beliefs true, right? So the explanation would go equally well if there were moral facts and if there were no moral facts. right? It does not depend. The moral sense would have been equally well selected if there were no moral facts. That's premise 3. Thus, we have no reason to assume that there are moral facts. Thus, no moral judgment is true. What that means is that when you say rape is wrong, or torturing puppies for the sake of it is wrong, what you're saying is not true, right? Because there are no moral facts that makes true that statement, right? All right. As you might guess, that argument is very controversial in philosophy, right? Anyway, philosophers like to argue there's nothing non-controversial in philosophy, but that argument is particularly controversial within philosophy. What most philosophers have done is they've been granting premise 1, they've been arguing, oh yeah, it's true, morality evolved, we have no quarrel with morality, with the evolution of morality. But they've been arguing that from premise 1, premise 4, conclusions 4 and 5 do not follow, right? So they grant 1, and they say, of course 1 is true, but 4 and 5 do not follow. That's not what I'm going to do today. What I want to do today is to follow another strategy. I want to question premise 1. I want to question the claim that morality evolved, right? And what I will do, in fact, is do 3 things. First, I will argue that the claim that morality evolved is, in fact, ambiguous. When philosophers, when evolutionary biologists, when psychologists say morality evolved, what they say is usually ambiguous and can be understood in at least 3 ways. And I'm going to focus here on the 3 possible interpretations of this claim. Then I'm going to argue that only 2 of these interpretations are empirically supported. The third one is not. There's no reason to believe that the third interpretation of the claim is true. But I'm going to argue that only the third interpretation has philosophical consequences. Right? So the first 2 interpretations are well supported, but they have no philosophical consequences. They do not show that there are no moral facts. The third one, which is not empirically supported, would show that there are no moral facts, would show that moral judgments are not true, but it turns out that it's not empirically supported. All right? So that's what I'm going to argue today. And that's the structure of the talk, and each section is going to be dedicated to one interpretation of the claim that morality evolved. Okay, so let's start with the first interpretation of the claim that morality evolved. As most of you know, there's been a lot of work in the last 10 or 15 years on moral psychology, right? And as I guess most of you know as well, there is a fair number of disagreements within moral psychology about the architecture of moral cognition, right? So some people are going to say, like Mark Hauser, are going to say, well, reason is what explains people's moral judgments, and emotions follow people's moral judgments. So you've got reason first, moral judgments, and then emotions. By contrast, someone like John Hyde is going to say emotion comes first, and then you've got a judgment, and then people start reasoning to justify in a post hoc manner their judgments. You've got many controversies, but everybody agrees on the following claim. Everybody agrees that the architecture of moral cognition is complex. Right? There's no disagreement between moral psychologists. It involves many components, including our capacity to mind read, our capacity to identify the causal structures of actions, and many emotions. So there is a wide agreement about the complexity of our moral cognition. And the first reading of the claim that morality evolved, the first way to understand what people mean when they say morality evolved is simply the claim that some of these components, some components of moral cognition, some of them evolved, right? So what that means is that you could try to identify their phylogeny by doing some comparative work. You can also try to determine whether there are adaptations, and if there are adaptations, what their adaptive function might well be, either by looking at their design or also by doing some comparative work. That way of understanding the claim that morality evolved is well illustrated by the work of Franz de Waal. So de Waal is absolutely clear about one thing. When he's saying that morality evolved, what he means is just and nothing more the fact that some components of moral cognition have evolutionary precursors. So they have a phylogenetic history, right? He's not saying anything more. Right? And the same thing could be said of Mark Bekoff, even so Bekoff is a little bit less clear than Franz de Waal about what he really means by the claim that morality evolved. So here what we have is people who endorse the simple claim that some components that make up our moral cognition have an evolutionary history. Now, what are we to make of this claim? Is that a well-supported claim? Should we take it to be controversial? Now, what's true is that claims about some specific components of our moral cognitions are controversial, right? For example, as many of you know, Franz de Waal and Sarah Brosnan have claimed that they find inequity aversion among various primate species, such as capuchin and chimpanzees. According to Brosnan and de Waal, capuchins and chimpanzees tend to reject a less preferred food when their partner is offered a more preferred food, right? So you offer some kind of mediocre food to a capuchin and you offer the grape to its partner, then the capuchin is likely to reject that less preferred food. And they say, the way they explain that finding is the fact that, well, look, capuchin and chimpanzee, just like human, have a sense of inequity aversion. They do not like unfair distribution of objects, right? So that's the way they explain this finding. Now, that claim, as many of you know, I'm sure, is extremely controversial, right? It's controversial in many respects. The first way it's controversial is that it has not been replicated with chimpanzees, for example. There's also alternative explanations of that claim, which just refer to the fact that a desired fruit, a grape, is present in the environment, and both the capuchins and the chimpanzee want that grape and are frustrated by the fact that they do not get that food. But even if we bracket this question, even if it were true that both capuchin and chimpanzees have a sense of inequity aversion, feel inequity aversion, it would still be unclear whether it's a homologue of human inequity aversion, right? Even if we grant, well, look, maybe there is a sense of inequity aversion, there will still be the next question of whether they have identified anything like a homologue of human inequity aversion. And the reason to be skeptic of that claim would be, for example, that among humans at least, inequity aversion seems to be more a culturally transmitted trait than a biological trait. And the idea is that inequity aversion varies tremendously across cultures, and as a result, it's not unclear whether it's a biological trait that has homologues in other cultures. So the whole point here is not so much to focus on Brosnan's and de Waal's work, but rather to say that whenever you look at some specific component of moral cognition, you're going to have controversies. You're going to have controversies whether they evolved. But what is not controversial is the following fact. What is not controversial is that as a general claim, it's extremely likely, it's almost sure, that some components of our moral cognition have an evolutionary history. And I think the best example comes from the work on our moral emotions, including, for example, the work on sympathy by Franz de Waal and colleagues. So there is very little reason to doubt that as a general claim, right, the morality evolved in the sense that some components of our moral cognition evolved. All right. So where are we? So what I've been doing so far is trying to focus on the first interpretation of the claim that morality evolved. That interpretation says very simply, moral cognition is complex, it is made of many elements, and some of these elements have an evolutionary history. Right? And I've been arguing that that claim, that general claim, is fairly uncontroversial, focusing mostly on the work on, and the reason is that because we have good evidence about the phylogeny of some moral emotions. Let's come back now to the philosophical question. Again, the philosophical argument tries to derive the fact that there are no moral facts and the fact that moral judgments are not true from the idea that morality evolved. Right? We started with that. Now the question is that reading, does the fact that some components of morality evolved provide any reason to conclude that that moral judgments are not true? Or does the fact that some components of moral cognition evolve give us any reason to assume that there are no moral facts? Right? So that's the question I would like to ask. And the answer is no. It does not give us any reason to do that. Why is that? Well, the best way to see why that's not the case is to think about scientific cognition. Right? Most of you guys are scientists, and you get involved in scientific thinking. When you are involved in scientific thinking, in scientific reasoning, most of the time you are using some systems, some of which, some evolved systems. So for example, you're going to use your capacity to make abductive inferences. You're also going to use your capacity to reason about causes, your causal reasoning. And it's very likely that many of these systems have evolved, right? But of course, you would not conclude from the fact that many of the systems involved in scientific reasoning many of the systems that are part of scientific reasoning have evolved, you would not conclude from that fact that there are no scientific facts and that our scientific beliefs are not true. Why would you not do that? Well, because in addition to these systems, you also need to appeal to scientific facts to explain why you have the beliefs that you have, right? So the fact that you have these evolved systems is only part of the story that explains why scientists have the beliefs that they have, all right? The same should be true of the moral domain, right? The moral domain here, we granted that some of the cognitive systems, some emotions that are involved in making moral judgments, some of these have evolved, right? And the question we're asking, does that show that there are no moral facts? The answer has to be no. Why? Well, because in addition to this system, we might need to appeal to some moral facts to explain why we have the beliefs, the moral beliefs that we have. All right? So I hope the first move is clear. So what I've been trying to do, I focused on one interpretation of the claim that morality evolved, some components of our moral sense evolved, and I concede that this claim is likely to be true, it's uncontroversial, but I've been arguing that nothing follows from that claim. Why is that? Well, because we might still need to be fair to mention moral facts to explain why people have the moral beliefs that they have. Yeah?
Can you clarify a little more what you mean by moral fact? Does that mean something like rape would be wrong even if none of us were here?
That's right.
Basically? That's what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. That's the fact.
Yes, that's one interpretation of moral facts. Yeah. That's the things in the world that make your belief, your moral judgments true or false.
So it's external.
That's right. Yes. It's not based on your beliefs, right? Exactly. All right. So let's move now to the second interpretation of the claim that morality evolved. All right. So humans are quite a strange species in many respects, right? We speak. We have a complex system of cultural transmission. We live about everywhere. Some people even want to live on the moon. So we're really a strange species. But an aspect in which we are strange, and philosophers have really spent a lot of time on this aspect of our strangeness, is the fact that we live in a world of norms, right? Most of our actions are influenced by the norms that we grasp, right? So here are some norms, some religious norms. That's a picture of Moses by Rembrandt. You also have just some etiquette norms. So that's a reproduction of Erasmus' book on the good manners of boys, which was published at the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century. But what this book does is that it gives you hundreds of behavioral norms, etiquette norms. An example of a very important norm back then, when you are at the table and you eat, you should put your towel on your left shoulder. If you put it on the right shoulder, that's extremely impolite, and people are going to be offended. Also, you should always put your towel on the left shoulder. Another example of norms that they had at the time, you should not spit across the table, right? Which you would have thought you would not need to explain to people that it's a bad idea to spit across the table. There might be someone in front of you, but you have to spit near you on the floor. So that's the kind of norms people felt they had to explain back then at the end of the 15th century, 16th century. We also have norms about food. So for some food to be kosher, it should not have that kind of, if it comes from an animal that has that kind of food here, how is that called again in English?
Well, cloven.
Okay, cloven. So if it has that kind of cloven stuff, you can't eat it, right? So in a systemic condition, it has to have that kind of food here. So again, it's a norm that people grasp, and some subgroup of people comply with this norm. Not only do we grasp norms, we are also a very obedient species, right? So we comply with norms. We are motivated to comply with norms in two different ways. We are motivated intrinsically. That's actually a quite striking fact. People want to comply with norms for the pleasure of complying with norms. Norms are an end in itself. We also sometimes motivated to comply with norms for external reasons, right? There are some norms we comply with, not because we want to comply with them, but just because we're afraid of punishment, for example. Not only people are obedient people, that's a picture from Milgram's experiment, but also people are motivated to punish other people. And indeed, so recent work in neuroscience has shown that people enjoy punishing other people, but you really didn't need to do any brain scanner to find out about that. You just needed to open any book in the medieval time about punishment to see that people indeed so that punishing other people is in fact a fairly enjoyable matter. So people get some kick out of hurting norm violators. So we live in a world of norms. We grasp a huge number of norms. We act on these norms either for extrinsic or for intrinsic reason. And also, we are motivated to comply with these norms. The second reading of the claim that morality evolved is just the claim that the capacity to grasp, to apply, and the motivation to comply with norms in general, any kind of norms, ranging from etiquette norms to food norms and so on and so forth. So the capacity to grasp, apply, and comply with norm evolved, and is probably, maybe, an adaptation. Now, that claim is obviously more controversial than the first one. The first one was a fairly uncontroversial claim, and the reason why this claim is somewhat more controversial than the first one is that for the first one, we have excellent, well, I would say good phylogenetic evidence that some emotions are present in other primates and probably other mammals. And of course, the fact that we have good evidence that these emotions are present in other species allows us to conclude that these emotions have a long evolutionary history. Not so for our capacity to grasp, apply, and comply with norms. And the reason here is that at least many people, and I don't have a deep opinion on the topic, but many people believe that only humans grasp and comply with norms. I don't exactly know the fact of the matter, but it's at least controversial whether any other species grasp, apply, and comply with norms. And if we're the only ones to live in a world of norms, then we're not going to find good phylogenetic evidence that supports the idea that this capacity has an evolutionary history. Right? So that claim has to be more controversial than the first interpretation of the claim that morality evolved. All right? But nonetheless, I believe there is some pretty good evidence that something like that this claim is true. And there are three lines of evidence that support the claim that our capacity to grasp norm is has in fact evolved and might be an adaptation. The first one is just some sociological and historical evidence. Norms are ancient and universal. To my knowledge, there is no society without norms, but I'd be happy to be corrected. And also that we find norms in many old historical pieces of evidence. That's a tablestone from which narrates the Epic of Gilgamesh, written about 5,000 years ago. And if you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you know that it's full of norms, right? And it's full of people complying and being motivated to obey a norm. So norms are ancient and universal. Also, it looks like children are very early on extremely good at reasoning about norms, right? And they're much better at reasoning about norms than they are at reasoning about similar formal issues, right? And that does suggest that our capacity to reason about norms is domain-specific. It's not an upshot of a more general capacity to reason. And that's evidence that there might have been selection for such a capacity. It's not decisive evidence, but that's at least a line of evidence. And the third type of evidence comes from some modeling evidence. There is a robust set of models that norms can be sustained in culture, and Boskachik and Rob and a few other people here have contributed to this literature. Now, if norms can be sustained by cultural transmission, then one might expect that the existence of norm might have created some selective pressures to be able to learn these norms, to be able to be motivated to comply with these norms, right? So the fact that under a large range of circumstances, norms are sustained by cultural transmission do suggest that there might have been some selective pressures to have the capacity to learn norms, to reason about norms, and also to be motivated to comply with norms. So we have three sources of evidence, again, historical, developmental, and some modeling evidence that somehow provide some support to the claim that our capacity to grasp norms and to comply with them is a product of evolution, right? And maybe an adaptation. Let's come back now to the philosophical question. Under the second reading, one is true, right? Does that show that there are no more facts? Right? Should we conclude from the fact that our capacity to grasp norms evolved? Should we conclude that, well, it is not true that rape is wrong, it is not true that torture is wrong, and so on and so forth? Well, the answer has to be no again, right? And the answer, and to see why it has to be no, you can go through this argument here. Suppose that the evolution of our capacity to grasp norms supports the conclusion that no moral judgment is true. Right? Suppose that we should conclude that there are no moral judgments, that no moral judgment is true because our capacity to grasp norms evolved. Then that's not only the case of our moral judgments, that's going to be the case of every normative judgment, right? Including the normative judgment we make in the epistemic domain, right? For example, you ought to reason according to the norms of logic, right? But of course, some normative judgments about epistemic matters are true. I mean, you have to reason according to the norms of logic, right? It's, there are epistemic, you have to make inferences according to inductive logic, right? So the argument would go, the evolution of our capacity to grasp norms does not entail that no moral judgment is true. What this argument shows is that you can't derive the conclusion you want to derive here, you can't derive that conclusion here from the general fact that our capacity to grasp norms evolved. You want something more specific. You want something that says our capacity to grasp a specific type of norm, not a capacity to grasp norms in general. Right? And indeed, that's what we're going to see in the third reading of the claim. So let me summarize what I've been doing. I moved from a first interpretation, which is uncontroversial, but which has no philosophical consequence, to a second interpretation, our capacity to grasp norms and to be motivated by norms, an essential part of human cognition, that has evolved. And I've been arguing it's clearly more controversial than the first interpretation, because there's no good phylogenetic evidence, but it seems to be fairly plausible. And I gave you three lines of evidence why it's fairly plausible. But I've been arguing that, well, that has no philosophical consequence. Why? Because it's too broad. Its consequences would be too broad. It would entail that you have no epistemic norms. And I do believe that you do have epistemic norms, such as, for example, you ought to reason according to the norms of logic. And if you don't do that, well, you're just wrong. Of course, I'm not going to punish you for that, but still, you're just wrong. Anyway, let me move now to the third reading of the claim that morality evolved. So, as I said earlier, we live in a world of norms, right? Uncontroversial claim. Another uncontroversial claim that at least we Westerners have a tendency to distinguish kinds of norms, right? So here is coordination norms, right? You ought to stop when light is red, right? So, or you ought to drive on the right side of the street in the USA. Here are etiquette norms. When you go to work in many companies, you have to wear a tie. But in addition to coordination norms and to etiquette norms, you also have, we at least Westerners recognize a distinct kind of norms, moral norms, right? So we have this sense, and I have this sense, and most people I talk to have this sense that there is something distinctive about moral norms, something that distinguishes them from etiquette norms and from merely coordination norms. And the third interpretation of the claim that morality evolves says that the capacity to grasp, apply, and comply with a distinct kind of norms, namely moral norms, evolve. So the question here is not anymore, it's not the capacity to grasp norms in general, it's the capacity to grasp that kind of norms, right? Moral norms. And people like philosophers, including people like Richard Joyce and earlier Michael Ruse in the 1980s, that's exactly what they're doing, right? That's exactly what they are claiming. They start by singling out a kind of norm, a specific kind of norm, moral norms, and then they argue that our capacity to grasp these norms, that kind of norm, evolved. All right? Now, should we grant that point? Should we concede that our capacity to grasp that specific type of norms, not norms in general, did that capacity evolve? Usually these people provide two arguments. The first one is that moral norms are universal, right? And the second one is that some moral knowledge is innate. And from these two arguments, they conclude that our capacity to grasp a specific kind of norms, namely moral norms, evolved. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to argue that none of these two arguments is, in fact, any good. So let's start with the claim that moral norms are universal. So first, target claim is so the universality of morality is evidence that it is a product of evolution. And here are some people making that claim. Richard Joyce, morality, by which I mean the tendency to make moral judgments. And here, remember, by moral judgments, it does not mean any normative judgment. It means a specific kind of normative judgment. Right? So morality exists in all human societies we have ever heard of. And Mark Hauser, also in his book, says the principles of the moral faculty constitute the universal moral grammar, a signature of the species. And in fact, it would be very easy to fill my talk with that kind of quotation. Kim Sterelny makes the same claim, and Nowak and Sigmund in many of their papers also make the same claim. All right, so that would be very easy to give you more quotations. Here's the argument, in very simple form. Moral cognition as a distinct kind of normative cognition is universal. The universality of a trait is evidence that it's evolved, hence evidence suggests that morality evolved. There would be a few things to be said about two. The connection between universality and evolution is far from being straightforward, but I believe that two could be patched up in a way that makes it more convincing. Rather, what I'm going to do is I'm going to challenge one. Moral cognition, as a distinct kind of cognition, is universal. And my main reason to be skeptical of that claim is that I'm not even sure to know what that means. I'm not even sure to know what the claim that moral norms are universal amount to, right? And because I don't exactly, and what I mean by that is that I'm not exactly sure to grasp what properties are distinctive of moral norms from other kinds of norms. And given that I don't know exactly what distinguishes moral norms from non-moral norms, etiquette norms, coordination norms, I don't really know whether in other cultures they also have moral norms, right? So the first thing I need to be given is exactly what are the distinctive properties of moral norms by contrast to other kind of norms. And as long as I'm not given that, then it's very unclear whether moral norms are indeed universal. So maybe one way to go to make progress on that question would be to examine the following issue. Maybe what we really want to know is whether people in many cultures, everywhere, tend to draw the same distinctions between kinds of norms. We know that people endorse different norms in different cultures, right? It's trivial. But in spite of these differences, they might draw the same distinctions, right? Everywhere, people might distinguish etiquette norms from moral norms. Of course, etiquette norms will vary across cultures, but the distinction etiquette norms versus moral norms is going to be universal. So everywhere, it might be that people distinguish etiquette norms from coordination norms from moral norms. Of course, it's an empirical question, and the worry is that, well, as far as we know, we don't know. I mean, we just have no good evidence at all. And I don't think the work has ever been done to support the claim that everywhere in the world, people are willing to distinguish the same kinds of norms. It's a very interesting empirical question, but to my knowledge, the evidence is just not there. So because the premise is just unsupported, it's very unclear whether, well, you should just reject this argument. So what I've been doing, what am I doing on time?
Fine.
Okay, good. All right, so what I've been doing with some colleagues is to try to address that question. With Steve Stitch and a few other people, we've been trying to start looking at, try to look at empirically at that question. It's really the start of a project, so I'm not going to show you very much, but here is what we try to do. We try to first identify how we, 21st century speakers of English, distinguish between moral norms and other norms. Let's say, what is a full concept of a moral norm? What does it mean for us to say that a norm is moral by contrast to an etiquette norm? And then, once we would have a good handle on that question, we would look at other cultures and see whether they draw the same kind of distinction. That's one research strategy. There might be other research strategies, but that's the kind of stuff we are trying to do. And again, since we're philosophers, we're fairly unsophisticated, but nonetheless, I'm going to be shameless and give you the kind of experiments we've been doing, study experiments. So we had, we had two probes, two vignettes. Here's the first vignette, and the vignette is very simple. You describe a situation where you have some anthropologists that go to some foreign culture, and they identify the norms, right? And here's the norms forbid to drink koraji, because koraji has stimulating and energizing properties, right? And then we ask people how they could help the anthropologists decide whether the norm is moral, right? So that's the basic probe, all right? Everybody got it? Here is a second version of the probe. It's the same probe except for one thing, which is the fact that people have reactive attitudes when the norm is violated. And it's fairly undefined yet. It's just being angry with the norm is violated and being motivated to punish, right? And the question is, do the Calvert actually believe that drinking cola is morally wrong? Right? So that's the first variable that we manipulated. The second variable that we manipulated was, we didn't manipulate it, but the second variable of the study was the following one. We compared Mormons, and here's Mitt Romney. It was not one of the subjects, but we compared Mormons and random guys, control John Does. And the reason we did that is that we were interested in the following question. When people endorse a given norm, are they likely to treat other norms which are similar to the norms they endorse as being moral? Right? And of course, Mormons endorse the norm that they should not drink energizing drinks, right? Or stimulating drinks. They should not drink coffee. I don't know about tea, but they should not drink alcohol, and so on and so forth. So we were wondering, would Mormons be tempted to use a norm they themselves are committed to decide whether another norm in another culture is a moral norm, right? So it was a 2-by-2 study, and here is what we found. Basically, we found that whether you're a Mormon or a control John Doe makes just no difference at all in your answer. So it does not look like, at least from that pilot study, we are trying to replicate the study extended in various ways, but from that pilot study, it does not look like people use their own norms, the norms they are committed to decide whether another norm is a moral norm, right? So that's the first result. And the second result, which is not completely unexpected, is that punishment, in fact, reactive attitude and the disposition to punish seems to be part of the full concept of a moral norms, right? People believe that if a norm is really a moral norm, then you should be willing to you should be willing to punish norm violators. Again, not an extremely surprising result, but the reason why I'm showing you this pilot study is not so much from what we learned from it, even though I was quite surprised to find no effect of the Mormon versus control comparison. But the one reason I'm showing you that is that it's a kind of stuff that could be done to answer the question, is morality universal, right? So you could first identify what the four concepts among modern speakers of English, and then go to other cultures and see whether they draw the same distinction, see whether they have the same concept. So that is maybe a research program that could be developed further. All right. Again, to summarize what I'm doing, I'm looking at the third interpretation of the claim that morality evolved. The third interpretation is that the capacity to grasp a specific kind of norm evolved. There are two main reasons that people mention to support that claim. Morality is universal, and some moral knowledge is innate. And I've been challenging the claim that morality is universal. Let me move now to the second claim, the idea that some moral knowledge is innate. And here is one way to put the argument. The acquisition of the capacity to make moral judgments in spite of impoverished stimuli is evidence for the existence of an innate faculty, by analogy with the language acquisition device, obviously, and the innateness of this faculty is evidence for the evolution of morality, right? Here is, again, we philosophers like to present arguments with premises and conclusion. Here's the main premise. Central components of moral cognition are acquired in spite of impoverished stimuli. The acquisition of a trait in spite of impoverished stimuli is evidence for an innate faculty to acquire this trait. Innate faculties evolved, hence evidence suggests that morality evolved. Again, I'm going to take 2 and 3 for granted, mostly for the sake of time. I have some quotes with 2 and 3. I've been arguing elsewhere that the notion of innate is in fact not a very clear notion, and we better do without that notion when we theorize. And same thing, the connection between being innate and being evolved is not entirely clear, but it does not really matter. I think 2 and 3 could be patched up to make this argument more convincing. What I'm going to do here is focus on 1, and I'm going to challenge 1. To see, now, people like Joyce and Roos, when they want to support 1, do 3 things. The first thing they do is that they identify a trait that is a central component or a feature, right? That is a central component of moral cognition. Then they show that this trait or this feature is acquired early, right? And then they show that at this age, this evidence is impoverished. So they could not have acquired, children could not have acquired this trait by learning or by experience. Of course, as you all know very well, the model comes from psycholinguistics or linguistics. Here what you have is some amazing work, I believe, done by Leeds and colleagues and published in Cognition. So they do exactly what I said Joyce should do. They identify an aspect of capacity to speak English as competent speakers of English. So when someone hears the noun phrase, the red ball, right, the red ball, there are two ways to pass that sentence. You could say the, red, and ball are three distinct constituents of that sentence. Or you could say the and red ball are two constituents of that sentence, and then red and ball are constituents of red ball. Right? It's two different ways to pass that sentence. We speakers of English, well, you speakers of English, know that two is the right passing structure of the sentence. Why? Well, because if I tell you the following sentence, I play with this red ball, and you can play with that one. The word one, the anaphor one, is used to refer to red ball, right? You understand that one refers to a red ball. What it shows is that red ball is a constituent of the noun phrase red ball. So it's part of a capacity to speak English as adults. So the next question is that part also of children's way to speak English? Well, it is actually. Strikingly, 18 months old. No, it's actually, I really find that unbelievable. They know that the right structure of the red ball is 2 and not 1 at 18 months old. Now the question is that could they have learned that by just listening to speakers? Well, what Leeds and colleagues do is that in fact, no, they could not have done that. Why? Well, because speakers of English very rarely use sentences that would allow children to distinguish between the two possible interpretations of the red ball. The conclusion is that children know innately, whatever that means, that the right constituent structure for the red ball is 2 and not 1. The idea is that people like Joyce and Michael Roos, who wants to run this argument, who wants to argue that we have an innate knowledge of morality, should do exactly the same thing. And in fact, that's what they do. More or less clearly, that's what they do. Right? So they start with looking for a feature of moral cognition that is essential to moral cognition. And most people, like Richard Joyce, for example, start with a well-known distinction between moral norms and conventional norms. I guess I can go very quickly with this audience about the distinction, but Thuriel and his colleagues have allegedly shown that there are two types of norms, moral norms and conventional norms. By that they mean people are disposed to draw a distinction between two kinds of norms. Moral norms, violating them is just to be seriously wrong. It's very bad to violate norms. The norms are meant to apply everywhere and at all time, and also they're authority independent. So if Barack Obama tells us tomorrow, it's okay to torture puppies from now on, well, it still would be wrong to torture puppies from now on. It does not depend on what Barack has to tell us, whether it's right or wrong. And also when people want to justify this norm, they refer to harm, the harm done to a victim, the rights of the victim, or to principles of justice. That's meant to contrast with conventional norms. Violating them is not very serious. They apply only locally, right? Conventional norms apply here in that room, but they don't apply in India. And they're authority dependent. So if Barack Obama says, it's okay not to wear tie in companies from now on, it's okay not to wear tie in companies from now on, right? Or maybe it's okay not to wear a tie in the White House from now on. It's okay not to wear a tie in the White House from now on. So that's, the idea is that that's part of the moral competence of people, right? That's part of what it means to be able to draw moral norms. Now, the claim has also been made that that distinction is acquired very early on, right? So for example, there's some work by Thuriel that suggests that 3-year-old children already have a disposition to draw the distinction. So very young children know that some norms, according to Thuriel and colleagues, know that some norms are moral and some are not. And what about the fact that there is very little impoverished stimuli, impoverished evidence that would allow children to learn the distinction between moral norms and conventional norms? Well, the work just here has not really been done. Nobody has been really looking at what kind of feedback children get when they violate the norms. So here it's very speculative. But people like Edouard, a philosopher, are not afraid to say that there is no good evidence that could allow children to learn the distinction between moral norms and conventional norms. And what he says to make this claim plausible is, well, look, the most suggestive idea could be, well, parents get more upset when a moral norm is violated than when a conventional norm is violated. Fairly not implausible, but she says no, that's not the case. Parents are equally hot under the collar about conventional transgression as they are about moral transgression. Right? So there's, again, what we have here is the poverty of the stimulus argument. The capacity to distinguish moral and conventional norms is a central component of moral cognition. 2, so this capacity is acquired very early. 3-year-old children are able to do it. 3, parents need to teach this distinction, and there is no evidence, there's no stimulus that will help children to learn this distinction. And here is the conclusion that Richard Joyce draws from that work. This results from developmental psychology, and here he refers to Trigel's work, strongly suggests that the tendency to make moral judgments is innate. And from that he goes on to say, innateness of this capacity shows that it evolved. All right, so I spent some time trying to explain out what he says. What I'm going to do now is, in fact, argue that there is very little evidence that the moral conventional is acquired early, right? And in fact, in addition, it's not even clear what the distinction really amounts to, right? So people like Turiel and their students, many of them, argue that there is good evidence that the distinction is acquired very early on. In fact, when one looks at many studies that have been done, what one finds is that in many cases, this distinction is not acquired by the 10th year. So for example, in a study by Schroeder and colleague, it was found, and here I'm quoting, there was not a single practice in all their study that 10-year-old children, that is viewed predominantly in conventional terms, and their subjects were 10-year-old, right? So it's not the case that, and there are also other studies by Carter and Patterson and a bunch of other people. You can go to see the review by Gabnesh and colleague, by Gabnesh in 1990, that shows that there are many studies that suggest that by 10-year-old, children are just very poor at distinguishing the so-called moral norm and conventional norms. Furthermore, there is surprisingly high amount of individual variation. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's not, that doesn't mean that it's not innate. Of course, you can have innate variation, but still it does suggest that it might be just learned, right? And depending on their environment, people might acquire the distinction more or less quickly, right? So it's just not the case, first. So remember the argument, for the argument to go, they have to show that the capacity to distinguish moral and conventional norms is acquired early. Well, that's just not the case. In fact, this distinction seems to be acquired rather late. The second problem is that, in fact, when we look at the classifications people want to make, is that it's not the case that norms fall into two distinct places that are going to differ in terms of the seriousness, universality, authority dependence, and justification. And here I'm going to rely on the work on Haidt and on Dan's work. Haidt, in his famous paper, has shown that some norms, which are judged to be universal, are in fact not do not bear on harmful actions. Remember the famous study, I guess everybody knows that, so I'll be very fast. A family's dog was killed by a car. I chose the less offensive one. A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. Exactly like what I would do. Low SES people, both in Brazil, as you can see here, and in the US, tend to judge that it's universally wrong to do that kind of behavior, right? Not so for high SES people, however. But what we have here, we have a norm: don't eat your dog, your pet dog, right? And now it does not bear on a harmful action. The dog was dead, right? You didn't hurt the dog. But that norm, even though it does not bear on a harmful action, is still judged to be universal. Right? So we have a norm that seems to be out of the two clusters identified by Turiel and colleagues. And the second norms comes from the work of Dan Kelly, Steve Stich, and Fessler, and Navarrete also. And the claim is that there are some norms, that's a drawing of Kelly, some norms against harmful actions are not judged to be universal and authority independent. And here is the vignette used by Dan and colleagues. So the vignette is the case where a sailor violates a norm and get whipped or whipped and get whipped. And the question, and in two different contexts, it's in a modern context and it's 300 years ago, and then you ask, was it wrong to do so? Now, if theory A is right, people should say, well, it was wrong now and it was wrong then, so time should not matter. But in fact, as Dan Fessler and other folks, and Dan Kelly and Steve Stitch have shown, well, time does matter. It's wrong now, but it was not wrong then. And also just much less serious for the action then. Right? What it does suggest is that contrary to what theory A would have at least have us expect, right? It's not the some norms which forbid harmful actions are not thought to be universal. And in fact, I would have thought that's obvious, right? I mean, there are plenty of norms in a way that we know are not universal, but even so they forbid harmful actions, right? But anyway, it's not obvious for some psychologists, so I think it was pretty good to show it. So what's the upshot? Well, the upshot, remember that was the argument. That's the argument from innateness that's meant to show that morality evolved. But the first premise of this argument is just not supported. It's not the case that the moral conventional distinction, a central component of morality, is acquired early, and it's not even clear what it really is, what this distinction really is. Okay, so what's the upshot? What's the upshot? Well, we've been focusing on a third reading of the claim that morality evolved. The third reading was our capacity to grasp a distinct kind of norms. Right? Not norms in general, a distinct kind of norms evolved. And we looked at the two main arguments for that claim. The first one, more norms are universal. And I've been arguing, what does that mean? I don't even know what that really means, and I've been arguing, here's the kind of evidence we would need to support that claim. Then we looked at the idea that there's some moral knowledge that is innate, and I've been challenging that claim. So I tend to believe that there is no good reason to believe that we have evolved a capacity to grasp and comply with a distinct kind of norm, specifically moral norms. Now, the question you want to ask me is, well, if it's not evolved, where does it come from, right? I mean, it seems to be like a complex trait, and so on and so forth. So why do we have that trait? And here, what I want to say, I don't have much evidence for that. It's just a speculation. But since I'm a philosopher, I'm perfectly allowed to do a sheer speculation. Here's what I'd like to say. Our capacity to grasp, apply, and comply with distinctively moral norms is a cultural invention. It's very similar to our capacity to play chess or our capacity to write. Both the capacity to write and the capacity to play chess are complex capacities. They involve many systems that have to work together, right? But they have to work together as to produce a functional outcome. The idea is that, well, but they're nonetheless invented, right? We can trace the history of their development, right? And they're culturally transmitted across generations. Now, the idea is that a capacity to grasp, apply, and comply with a distinct kind of norms, the norms that we nowadays, Westerners, recognize as moral norms, and maybe liberals recognize as moral norms, this capacity, in fact, is also a historical invention, and also was culturally transmitted. Now, if that's true, the conclusion is that when you ask me, so where does morality as a capacity to grasp a distinct kind of norm come from? I should say, I don't know. But that's not the job of the biologist to find out. It's the job of the historian, and the historian looking at very specific cultures. Again, that's not a new view at all. In fact, that's a view that already was formulated by Friedrich Nietzsche about 100 years ago. Of course, Nietzsche got the details very wrong. He had this fancy story about the Jews taking power. But let's forget about the crazy details of Nietzsche's story. The basic idea that the moral sense is a historical invention, I do believe, is something that people should consider much more seriously. All right, let's come back to the philosophical question. Again, the issue here is, does the fact that morality evolved show that there are no moral facts and that no moral judgment is true? Right? And I've been arguing that under the first two readings, well, nothing follows from the first two readings. What about the third reading? Our capacity to grasp a distinct kind of norms evolved. Well, then, very clearly, it would seem that the conclusion would follow. There are no moral facts and no moral judgment is true. However, as I've been arguing, there is just no reason to believe that morality, as a distinct kind of normative cognition, has evolved. So the situation is the following one. If one were true, understood as this third reading, then the conclusion would follow. But it turns out that there's no reason to believe that one is true. All right, let me summarize the talk. I've been arguing that the claim that morality evolved is ambiguous, right? And I've tried to spell out three different readings. And I also would insist that very often, it's unclear in the literature, when people write about the evolution of morality, what they really mean, which reading they in fact endorse. And I believe it does create a fair amount of confusion among biologists, psychologists, and philosophers. And I think it would be useful to try to be more cautious about what is said. And the reason why it's important to be more cautious is that there is often the following kind of argument. People provide evidence for one of the reading, and then they conclude that the other one is supported, which is, of course, a fallacy. Yes? People provide evidence that, oh, some components of morality evolved, and they're going to conclude that the stronger claim also is true. But nonetheless, I've been arguing there are three readings. So the first one is that the cognitive systems that underlie our moral judgments have evolutionary precursor. And I've been arguing, yes, that's a claim that is fairly uncontroversial, applied to specific components that's bound to be controversial, right? But as a general claim, that's a claim that's uncontroversial. However, I've been also arguing that nothing follows from a philosophical point of view from that, right? So from a philosophical point of view, then it's not particularly interesting. Then I looked at the second reading, the capacity to grasp, apply, and comply with norms in general evolved. And I think there's no phylogenetic evidence, to my knowledge, again, but I think that's a fairly reasonable hypothesis. I think it's supported by various lines of indirect evidence. However, I've also been arguing that nothing follows from that claim, because that will have too broad consequences. Now, and then I move to the third reading, which is the capacity to grasp, apply, and comply with distinctively moral norms evolved. And I've been arguing that if that were true, oh sure, striking philosophical consequences would follow. But turns out that it's just not true. In fact, our capacity to grasp a distinct kind of norms, in fact, might well be a cultural invention, which is culturally transmitted. So the conclusion is that philosophers have been kind of involved in a wild goose chase, right? They've been looking for something that they didn't manage to get, right? What they really wanted to, what they got, didn't give them what they wanted. And what they wanted, well, they didn't really get it, right? So there is no philosophical middle age to be gotten out of the research on the evolution of morality. So much of that is written in that following paper, if you're interested. And I would like to thank you for your attention.